Module 9. Sustainable Outsourcing. Over the last decade, the pharmaceutical industry has become increasingly focused on the topic of sustainability, with companies setting challenging ESG goals. ESG stands for Environmental, Social and Governance, and it's a framework commonly used to evaluate a company's sustainability and ethical impact. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were developed in 2015 to cover a wide range of issues under the umbrella of sustainability. They were created with the aim of peace and prosperity for people and the planet, while tackling climate change and working to preserve oceans and forests. And while all are important, for companies it's the environmental goals which are perhaps the most challenging, especially in light of growing concerns around climate change and environmental issues. The healthcare industry is responsible for 5% of global carbon emissions, which, to put it in context, is more than the aviation industry, which is around the 2.5% mark. All the major pharmaceutical companies have made sustainability pledges and set a target for when their business will hit net zero, meaning that by this date the company's activities, products, services and supply chain will have no net impact on greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see by the companies listed here, the goal for going net zero tends to be between 2040 to 2050, but there are many other milestones to be hit in the meantime. A common way to categorise greenhouse gas emissions are into Scope 1, 2 and 3. Known as the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, a company's emissions are classified within these three scopes. Scope 1 is direct emissions from sources owned or controlled by the company, such as emissions from a company's fleet of vehicles. Scope 2 refers to indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy, such as electricity, steam, heating and cooling, while Scope 3 refers to all other indirect emissions that occur in the company's value chain, including emissions caused by the production of purchased goods and services and transportation of materials. All activities by outsourced suppliers fall under Scope 3, and it's by far the largest category. According to the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Initiative, 80% of PSI members' carbon emissions come from Scope 3 and are in the supply chain. It's clear then that working with suppliers will be critical for companies to achieve their decarbonisation goals. We're now going to look at how to turn these corporate goals into action by implementing sustainable outsourcing. The first step is to identify your most important suppliers. Fred Turco is Pfizer's Vice President of Enterprise Indirects and is Sustainable Sourcing Lead. He explained that from the 45,000 suppliers Pfizer rely on, there are a few hundred suppliers that dictate nearly 80% of overall emissions. So the first thing is to segment those suppliers. Then they will assess their maturity level on a scale of 1 to 5, based on the supplier's emissions, their understanding of sustainability, public commitments and reporting. He goes on to explain it's worthwhile to set up two main tiers of supplier management. The first is based around compliance and risk management, and is to ensure that all suppliers comply with the applicable regulatory standards, especially those that centre around the import and export of goods. Suppliers are managed through a process of due diligence, onboarding, ongoing performance management, escalation management in the event of a compliance concern, and reporting. Then there is a voluntary programme for those suppliers that choose to mirror the company's wider ESG commitments, which includes commitments to supplier diversity and to net zero. Next, engage your supply chain. To be successful, it's important to have a partnership mindset when approaching negotiations with your supplier base. Implement supplier engagement programs and data collection processes to gain better visibility. Work closely with suppliers to drive sustainability improvements by sharing best practices and fostering a culture of continuous improvement. Invest in providing training, resources and incentives to help suppliers to build their sustainability capabilities. Inviting key suppliers to participate in supplier days is a proven way to motivate and encourage collaboration. It's important to integrate ESG into all sourcing and vendor management operations. René Weinmann, Chief Procurement Officer at Exelia Pharma, explains that sustainability needs to become part of the natural sourcing DNA of procurement teams and integrated into everything we do. He says sustainability should not be a separate function or discipline, but has to be part of every category manager's day-to-day work. Collaborative leverage is an effective way of standardising ESG requirements for suppliers. Robert Williams, Sustainable Procurement Director for AstraZeneca and Vice Chair of the PSEI, explains there's real collaborative leverage from getting supply chains to act together, because when 3 or more companies ask the same question to suppliers, 95% of the time the suppliers will respond and work towards improving their maturity. So it's worth getting involved with industry-wide initiatives and aligning your asks with that of your peers. You can only manage what you can measure. So collecting data on supplier emissions and being able to analyse it is key. This information needs to be put into the hands of team members who are making decisions so that they can drive improvements with suppliers. Examples of measurement tools used across the pharma industry includes EcoVadis, which is a sustainability assessment platform used by many pharmaceutical companies to manage ESG risk and compliance. As an example, AstraZeneca now has 2,000 suppliers rated by EcoVadis, representing over 60% of their spend. And the use of science-based targets, SBTI, has become common across the industry, as well as various other solutions. And it's not just about the manufacturing process. You should also work with suppliers to optimize logistics, aiming to reduce emissions from transportation and distribution. Daiichi Sankyo's Philip Kutsier shared an example of how changing processes with an existing supplier can be used to save costs and improve sustainability. He gives an example of a product that was packaged at one site, which was then shipped across Germany before being shipped right back past their front door on its way to Spain or Italy. By fixing this process, the company have saved 800 kilometres of unnecessary travel, which equated to around €200,000 a year. His advice is simply look at what you do and find an easier way to do it. Teva Pharmaceuticals have recently been recognised as one of the most sustainable companies in the world by Time magazine. Amalia Adler-Waxman is Teva's SVP of Sustainability and ESG. She explains their approach to managing Scope 3 emissions, which for Teva are around 90% of their overall carbon emissions. Firstly, identify critical suppliers, and then work closely with those suppliers to reduce emissions. Measure their output using tools like EcoVadis for supplier assessment, and encourage suppliers to adopt more stringent science-based targets. She also flags the need to balance emission reduction goals with the need to maintain supplier diversity, as there's a risk of only working with larger companies. And some final advice. We asked Chris Shanahan, Thermo Fisher Scientific's VP of Global Sustainability, what is the best way to make progress towards sustainability goals? His answer? Get started. He acknowledges that sustainability can be intimidating and overwhelming. It's complicated and we don't have all the information. But if everyone gets started, we will eventually come together. So don't put it off. Takeaways from this module. Supplier engagement is critical if the industry is to hit its corporate sustainability goals, as 80% or more of emissions are in the supply chain. Integrate sustainability into all procurement and supply chain activities, setting clear expectations in contracts. Measure suppliers with tools like EcoVadis and SBTI. Prioritise those suppliers who share your values and reward success. And use the power of collaborative leverage to drive a greater impact. In the next video, Dr. Roxana Timmermans provides an overview of green manufacturing and some of the levers you can pull to make a difference. Make sure to take the quiz to test your learning.